Welcome to Moving Medicine Forward, a podcast presented by CTI Clinical Trial and Consulting Services. This podcast is centered on advancements in healthcare and elevating individual stories and their expertise. I'm your host, Jeremy Schran, and together with my co-host, Raina Graham,
hello,
we will take you through a deep dive of CTI, clinical research, the patient journey, and much more. On today's episode, we discuss model-informed drug development, MID for short, and regulatory and scientific affairs, or RSA, and how these two teams work together to help bring drugs to market. And who better to discuss these topics with than our own CTI experts in the field, Monica Rodriguez, Executive Director of MID from the Bilbao, Spain office, and Christine Normantiner, Executive Director of RSA. Let's join the conversation with Monica and Christine now. So how does MID differ from traditional drug development approaches?
Well, we really are kind of integrating knowledge to make the process much more efficient. So traditionally, big pharmaceutical companies worked very much in silos. So, for example, the non-clinical groups were communicating not very much efficiently with the clinical team. So information was kept kind of just for informing or describing how the drug worked in non-clinical species, but not doing that translation into clinical, or for example, a translation to healthy volunteer data, which is called phase 1 trials, into further clinical development in patients like phase 2, phase 3. So model-informed development, or the type of work we do, is kind of using the information from one stage to the other to translate and to bring all the knowledge forward.
Do you always come in at the front end of a clinical trial, or what stage are you coming into the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do come before the clinical phase as well, so we can analyze data that is coming from the non-clinical phase to inform first in human trials, for example. That's a very important piece of the work we do, because that's where dosing, for example, is much more uncertain. You have a lot of non-clinical data, animal data that is also informing about efficacy and safety of the drug, but not in humans. So that first step into human trials is a very important step and milestone for pharma companies. So we also work in that stage, helping with the integration of all that data that has been collected in non-clinical stages to inform and design efficient clinical trials.
So you talked about the efficiencies and that being one of the key benefits, but what are some other benefits to using MID in drug development? And then what are some of the challenges that you experience?
Yeah, so maybe I will start with challenges first.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of challenges, and sponsors most of the time trying to understand what is the added value of the work we do. We are aware that mathematical models and complex statistics are not always well understood. So we do have a big learning process to try to train sponsors to see that we're not trying to trick, we're not trying to hide, but we're trying to make use of all the information that has been gathered.
And what does that training process look like? Are you sitting down with the sponsor?
We sit down with the sponsors. We show them case studies. So we work a lot in summarizing case studies together with the sales team as well. So how to communicate what we do and what we have learned with other developments, so that they see themselves reflected in those same problems, because most of them have very, very similar issues in drug development, and how we have solved them in the past. And it is also very important to let them know that regulators such as the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration here in the US, are very much into modeling. They understand what we are doing, and they are open to using this type of approaches as well.
You talked a little bit about collaborating and educating the clients, so the sponsors that we're working with pharmaceutical companies. But how do you collaborate with sponsors to develop and implement MID strategies? What's kind of walk us through the process of bringing the MID team on board for a project?
No, that is a great question, because I also want to mention that the MID group at CTI is kind of differentiating from other groups that can also develop this type of models, because we really build models for purpose. So we first like to sit and understand exactly what is the need of the client. So what is the strategic question they need to answer, and then build that model that is fit for that purpose specifically. You can imagine that you can get data from clinical trials and do lots of very fancy, complex mathematical models that can explain that data. But if you don't have the strategy or the way to really make those models answer the question that you have, the client will or the sponsor will not be using them adequately. So we're not just providing that mathematical knowledge or approach, we're also providing the application and how that can be useful for a regulatory, for example, question or hurdle, or for a clinical trial optimization that is needed. So it's very important to sit with sponsors, understand their data, understand their needs, and then build a model that is customized for that need.
What unique advantage does a CRO like ourselves offer in the realm of MID compared to like an in-house pharmaceutical or another entity that's analyzing data? What makes us stand apart?
Well, on the one hand side, I like to say that one thing that differentiates us is that we generate the data. So that is very important for us, that we are using that data to integrate and make a model that can be used for decision making. So we say trash in, trash out. So if the data is not good, then whatever we extract from the model will not be really applicable or conclusive. So starting from the lab work that we generate, so the pharmacokinetic data comes from the lab that we have at CTI. So then we see that that data is like noise free, so that it doesn't have a lot of variability, a lot of noise. And then when you develop models with data that has been generated in-house, you know where it comes from, or you can ask if there has been any issue with that data that you need to be aware of. That really makes the modeling, efforts and conclusions much more robust. And the same with the clinical trial data.
Now, is your office located in our Spain lab? Are you
Yeah.
working with them on a daily basis
Exactly.
to interact
So
with them?
I'm located in the Spain lab in Bilbao, and I work very closely with the lab team.
So, what advice would you give companies that are looking to navigate regulatory challenges related to MIDD?
So the advice that I will give them is to come to us, as soon as possible. So we can. I say that we usually like to anticipate to the problems. So we have a strategic vision of drug development. We have more than 20 years of experience in drug development and using modeling, also in the regulatory space. So we have encountered lots of different problems that we have solved. So coming to us, sooner will help us drive the efficiency of their clinical trials and their clinical development.
What are some of the common misconceptions clients have about MIDD, and how do you address them?
Yeah, so I think one of the general misconceptions that clients have about what we do in modeling is that they're going to invest money in a model that will generate more questions than answers.
Mm-hmm.
So they always think, okay, I have like all these answers that I need to provide. Well, I will invest in, 5 or 6 developments. So in generating more data, when we tell them you can really answer those questions with a model, they think I will invest in this and then I will have to generate the data again. So then we spend a lot of time in our conversations with them trying to show them how this is not really true, and showing them case examples of past work where modeling has been a success. Also, another misconception is that models are giving you the answers that you want them to provide. So this is why they also think, we will go to regulatory agencies and then we will see that everything was a trick with this model that we don't really understand,
Mm-hmm.
because it's really giving us the answers we wanted it to provide. And that's not true, because we're really using the data that they have or that has been developed to generate knowledge and just integrate in a different way. And a good friend of mine says that we're not pharmacomagicians, we are pharmacometricians, which is that we measure what the drug is doing. And this is a very interesting common misconception of what we do, because other clients approach us and said, can you do this for me with the data that I have? But maybe they have like one small clinical trial. Well, there's nothing we can do with that, or the data is not adequately generated and we can really not take, a lot of information from that data set.
How do you envision the impact of your work on the future of drug development?
Well, I see that people are being more aware of the use of modeling and simulation, not only in like pharma industries, also biotechs and also regulators. So I see that it is going to be more widely applied to other areas. So we're seeing a shift, for example, in rare diseases where the application of this type of modeling and simulation are absolutely, let's say, informative because the data sets that you have are very, very slim and you don't have a lot of information and you need to dose, for example, children in pediatric rare disease. That is an area that is evolving very quickly and where this type of models are of much a need. Also, we're seeing a big, let's say, development in oncology because it's an area where modeling has been very useful for many years. And also in complex diseases where, for example, gene and cell therapy modeling has been newly applied in the last like 2 or 3 years to this type of complex therapeutics, and where we can be of added value also to streamline drug development in those difficult areas.
Yeah, so we know that you guys collaborate a lot with sponsors on bid defense meetings, but in what ways do you guys collaborate in your day to day? What are you working on projects?
Yeah, so both our groups collaborate very closely because what we do in model informed development needs also a regulatory strategy and application. So both teams are very much closely linked, and we work together in many projects successfully.
Yeah, I do find that messaging is one of the hardest parts of modeling, which is why an experienced team that works together and knows how to collaborate together to ensure that the data is understandable and presented appropriately to the people that are going to be making the decision is important. If the findings and the interpretation is lacking, then the impact and the benefit will be affected. So messaging is key.
What are the regulatory authorities' views on increasing use of MIDD, and how do you advocate for its acceptance?
Yeah, so maybe I will start talking a little bit about the pilot program in the FDA. So this is a program that started some years ago. I think it was like 4 years ago at the FDA in the clinical pharmacology group. So they started this pilot program to see how modeling could be of use and application in drug development because they were sure that drug development was had a lot of inefficiencies and wanted to see how modeling could be of added value. So we have been closely linked to this pilot program in the FDA, and they give advice to pharmaceutical companies or biotechs on how to use modeling and simulation to streamline drug development. And this is where we have been very closely working with Christine's group and the regulatory application of modeling in drug development.
So, one of the things that we have understood as we started to embrace modeling is understanding that every interaction with any individual regional authority is very important. So, we continue to learn and to build and to capitalize and leverage that experience to be able to serve the next client. So, it is critical that a modeling partner is trusted and a respected professional when analyzing the data and interpreting the results. So we have found that not all modeling groups are equal in rigor or modeling activities are the same. So having the right team with the understanding of the disease and is intimately familiar with the equations, that is critical in driving the modeling to make sure that the analysis is successful. So it cannot be stressed enough that this is not a plug and play exercise if you want to optimize the value of the modeling experience.
You talked about the importance of communication, Christine. What are some of the common challenges you both face when aligning MID with regulatory expectations? And how do you work together to address those challenges and work through them?
Generally, it's really all about messaging. When we are introducing modeling to our clients, they're in the novel and cutting edge technology. They're usually coming out of think tanks and academic environments. So they haven't been exposed to modeling and simulation. So it's a very new concept. Priming the client with understanding what the capabilities of modeling and simulation are before Monica's team gets into the technical discussions really helps to set the stage, level sets so that the sponsor is more receptive. It's not, they have time to chew on what the possibilities are. And then when we start actually getting into the details with the modeling group discussing what they can actually do, it's very beneficial. So we really work together. Once the client goes into the modeling and then the analysis comes back, then it's our responsibility to interpret that information in a way that the regulatory bodies will accept so that we can enable that negotiation process to start from that point.
Yeah, Christine, adding that there, I think it is very important for us to make them aware how regulators can accept and understand the modeling activities that we're doing. Because sometimes, as you mentioned before, we are using models to replace maybe a non-clinical study or even speed up a clinical development program, which may sound as we are using something that maybe is not, let's say, accepted by regulators or by investors that are trying to put money into a specific development program. So I think having your view and our combination of expertise into a call with a client is of added value so that they can see that the type of work we do it will be accepted as well by regulatory agencies.
That's actually a good point on the investor perspective, because as new of a concept as modeling and simulation is to the scientists, it is still a pretty scary thought and a risky thought from an investor perspective. So oftentimes we will help support sponsors by creating slide decks to try to message not just to the regulators, but to message to the investors to educate them so they understand the values and that they're a little bit more willing to invest in what is essentially going to be a cost savings and a time savings, but it's an alien to them. It's not something that is seen across the industry yet, but it will be.
Yeah, and just to finalize on that thought, we're just integrating and analyzing data that is already there, but it's kind of seeing that data in a way that has not been seen together before.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not generating new data or, let's say, inventing things, but it's just using or maximizing the data that is available to be applicable to a specific, to answer a specific question. So, for example, what is or how does my drug, let's say, compare versus other products that are out there already, and how can my drug be of added value with the information that I already have, and what do I need to generate to make my drug more competitive in the landscape? And sometimes when they see these figures coming out from nowhere, they don't even know where the data is coming from and how a model can be able to predict those outcomes. We've had this experience before that they say, well, is this really coming from my data set? How can you come up with these conclusions that nobody has thought of before? So I know it is sometimes scary for them to believe what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think what's nice is being able to bring in their data and then into the data that's available in the public domain. So you're not just using your own data sets from that individual lab, but you're looking at historical, known and accepted, scientifically accepted data sets that everybody knows, everybody's familiar with, and you're applying that information and feeding it into a much larger story. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, you talked about the alignment with the FDA and how you work closely with them. Walk us through what that looks like. Are you advocating on behalf of the sponsor with the regulatory authorities, or are you providing the sponsor with a deck that they can then take to the regulatory authority? What does that interaction look like?
So I think we've done everything. So we always like to, because of what we have mentioned before, that acceptance, from the sponsor is not always like their first feedback that we get. We like always to drive them to a kind of scientific advice or a meeting with the FDA so that they can feel that what we're doing will be accepted by regulators at the end. So we always try to push them in that direction as well, so that they feel that we're doing science that is already accepted by regulatory bodies.
Yeah, and as far as where do we stand as far as who we're representing, we're always going to be representing and looking out at the best interests of the sponsor. So that is our first level of responsibility. But at the same time, because we engage with the agencies on such a frequent basis, we understand where their pain points are. We understand where they're coming from, and some of the guidance that they are providing to the sponsors are not necessarily specific to their program, but it's accumulated from other programs, and so they're repackaging their knowledge and fitting it to a sponsor's program. So we try to interpret, we try to be that middleman because regulatory talk is its own language, and it's difficult to interpret. You think it's English, it's written, it's got a period at the end, but five people can read it and five people will have a completely different interpretation of what was said. So we try to be that intermediary.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, Christine, it's the fact that as a CRO, you're constantly working on projects across the board. You have specific therapeutic expertise across these different trials, but then you've also worked with the FDA and other regulatory authorities across the board on different types of projects. So that communication and that lessons learned that you can apply to the next project to really benefit the sponsors.
How do the global regulatory differences impact the implementation of the MIDD strategies? What's the best practices you've developed for navigating these variations?
There's, the modeling and simulation group at the FDA was one of the pioneers in using this type of methodologies and applying them or applying these methodologies to their own decision making within the agency. They were doing their own analysis, and this is how they encouraged, pharmaceutical companies and other groups to use this type of tools as well to answer questions that may come up during drug development. So even if they were the first ones to apply it and have been using modeling for over 30 years, agencies such as the European Medicine Agency or local authorities that we have in Europe have been slowly applying also the use of modeling and simulation for regulatory decision making. This came into force with the pediatric investigational plans and the laws in Europe around 2007. And that is when agencies in Europe also started to understand and to use this type of methodologies for their own purpose and encouraging companies as well in Europe to use them. There's also a spread into Asian countries. For example, the PMDA in Japan is also, let's say, learning and acquiring this type of methodologies for their own assessment, and they have a dedicated group in Japan as well. So it's expanding across the globe slowly. And one thing that I wanted to mention in this topic as well is that we use modeling also efficiently to translate from one population to the other. So, for example, data that has been generated in the US can be already used to prepare or plan a development program, for example, in Asia, and you don't have to replicate, everything again in Asian population, but you use modeling to translate what you know already and the differences that you may have between ethnic groups, for example, from a pharmacokinetic point of view or in efficacy and safety that can be modeled, simulated, and then you just have to perform confirmatory studies in that specific population. So that is called ethno-bridging, so bridging information from one ethnicity to other, and it's something that we also do here at CTI.
Awesome.
Mhm. I think that's going to be very critical as we start diving deeper and deeper into diversity. And that's going to be I think, a driving factor going forward in the industry.
Exactly, because now trials need to be informative not only for a specific patient population, but widely, because if they're going to be used even inside the US for different subpopulations that may not be represented in clinical trials. So this is something that the type of modeling that we do, which is called population modeling, is also applied for. So how can you use or extrapolate data, for example, in a very reduced cohort of subpopulations inside your clinical trials, but how can you use modeling to make that reduced cohort conclusive for dose adjustment or for a different dosing scheme? So I think that is a very interesting area of application of modeling as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I don't think you really touched on is how valuable modeling is, not just in confirmatory or predictive as a confirmatory or a predictive tool, but how it's been of benefit, at least from working with your group on reformulations, and then also trying to address a very neglected population, which is the pediatric patient population.
Yeah.
We always want to hesitate to do too much too soon in that population. And I mean, it might be helpful just to kind of explain how modeling has been, um, a very powerful power tool for pediatrics.
That's a great point. So how does modeling affect pediatrics research?
Yeah. So one point that Christine just touched on is formulation. So you can imagine that in pediatrics, you cannot always use the same formulations that you use in adults. And with current regulations, you are kind of forced to have a pediatric development plan when your adult development is in phase 2. You don't have a lot of data. You are focusing on your adult development, and then you have to plan how your pediatric development would look like, because they're trying to agencies encourage pharmaceutical companies to develop drugs that are specifically tailored for this for pediatric population. And you have to select already the doses that you're going to use in those pediatric patients without having data in patients. And also you have to develop specific formulations for them, because maybe they cannot swallow big tablets or capsules. So using modeling and simulation to predict what the, let's say, dosing regimens and how the drug will work in the different age groups and the different weight groups. So it's not the same if you dose a child, that is weighing 30 kilos or that is 5 or 6 years old versus an adolescent, and how to predict the doses and also the formulation adjustments that are needed for that population without running the clinical trials.
Yeah, the other thing too is there was a project that we worked on that we had the unknown or unanswered question about how hormones impact the ADME of a certain product, and we were like, okay, we don't have any idea of how to answer this, and you guys were able to take that and at least provide a narrative that we could present to the agency of, this has been thought of.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, so what we have learned also throughout the years is that most of the time agencies would like to have a justified approach, and sponsors come just with a conclusion. Okay, we want to use this dose, we want to use like this approach in pediatrics as well, but the agencies are just looking for a way to justify. And with modeling, sometimes you can help in this justification, and this is where regulatory experience and modeling experience can be of added value to just craft an answer and a justification for a dosing regimen or a specific population.
mhm.
Can you describe your role in interacting with regulatory health authorities like the FDA, Health Canada, the MHRA, and the EMA?
Yeah. So, on a daily basis, I really oversee a fantastic team of regulatory professionals, translational scientists, and medical and clinical writers. Each person in the RSA team brings a special skill, a special background and experience, and we really try to leverage everybody's um, skill set for any given client that comes to us with special needs or special attention. So I think that having that wide variety of experience really is a benefit for our sponsors. In As far as interacting with the agency, I oversee the written correspondence going to the agencies and coming back, also, doing the interpretation of the regulatory speak, and then trying to find solutions for some of the information requests that come our way. I also serve as a moderator in face-to-face or live teleconferences or video conferences that we have with the agency, just helping to facilitate discussions, making sure that we don't get bogged down into one topic and then we have half of the agenda that remains untouched. So I really just try to be that conduit of information to make sure that the programs are taken care of for both sides, the regulatory and the sponsors' needs.
What are some of those common challenges that you face when you communicate with the regulatory bodies, and how do you overcome them?
So while the documents are harmonized in ICH, I find that the requirements for each region vary significantly. So one regulatory body may have a different threshold for non-clinical or manufacturing requirements than in one country, and it may be stricter in another country. And without having, I think, harmonization of what really constitutes safe to start is a big challenge, because then that forces clients or sponsors into going into or seeking other countries that may not be the best fit for their indication, for their drug, but the regulatory environment is much more appealing or easier for them to get a foot into the clinical. So we're always looking for a way of keeping an eye on what the limitations are from the sponsor. I mean, how much money do they have? How much time do they have? And trying to figure out, where are we going to find these patients? And is this the right regulatory environment for us to pursue those activities? So it's a balance. It's a salad that we mix around.
How do you ensure the clinical trials are designed to meet the stringent requirements of the regulatory authorities?
So I think that this is a clear example of approaching this from a global eye. Everybody wants to try to put one foot lightly into the water and test the waters out as we're going into a new clinical development opportunity. And what ends up happening is we might focus on one region versus, and instead of having a global eye to the whole entire program, and having it maybe a more myopic view can end up costing time and money later on. I think having a group of people who come in and understand the issues and the challenges associated with a specific indication, a specific drug class, some of the challenges that are very specific in maybe this product's manufacturing limitations, and having those discussions early and often are really key to addressing those challenges by one, identifying, planning for them in the future, and then preparing some risk mitigation as part of your regulatory strategy.
How do you stay up to date with the evolving guidelines and requirements for different regulatory authorities worldwide?
So, our team is comprised of regulatory affairs professionals, translational scientists, medical writers that use a combination of methods to stay current on the rapidly evolving area of regulatory guidances. So, for any given day, the FDA is going to release a plethora of draft guidances or final guidances. And when you couple that with other regions, it becomes quite
Yeah.
intensive. So we try very hard into one, providing adequate time for each person to become aware and familiar of the critical guidances that are coming out, what some of the trends in the industry. So we really want that competitive market intelligence
Mhm.
from the regulatory groups that comes out. That's important. We also have weekly meetings that we roundtable discussions on some of our projects, and we have sanity checks and touch points, and anything new that is discovered that we think is going to be critical in sharing with our peers, we share that at the weekly meeting. We also have monthly meetings where we have a very specific time where we have knowledge share and regulatory intelligence forum where we compile all of the newly released draft documents and final documents. and share that with the entire team. It's just part of that knowledge share. And then we also have a repository of said documents available on our internal SharePoint that is constantly updated on a weekly basis for anything new. So we try very hard to put processes into place that will feed the knowledge base that all of the team members have, both for domestic and ex-US.
What are some future trends in MIDD and regulatory affairs that you believe will shape the pharmaceutical industry?
So just recently, the FDA came out with the 3 Rs: reduce, reuse, and replace. And that's specifically talking about non-clinical or the use of animals in the non-clinical or preclinical space. And I think that as MID modeling and simulation and AI continues to mature, continues to evolve and to be accepted, I think that that is going to be a significant impact on the entire, not just the drug development experience, but also the clinical development experience, because it very much folds hand to hand as you go through the life cycle of a product in the clinical stage. So if it's done right, modeling, simulation, AI, all of that will come back to be revisited as we move from preclinical to phase 1. And then we continue to build that story because we've got new data that we're folding into the model. And then it informs even further into our phase 2 and all the way up into market application and commercialization. So as we get more technologically driven, I think that the opportunities to decrease timelines, to help control costs, and to get products to the patients faster is going to be revolutionary at some point.
That's awesome. Thanks for listening. On next month's episode, we will be celebrating CTI's 25 years with members of the CTI leadership team. So be sure to subscribe and share this podcast with someone you know. And tune in next time as we continue to discuss how we are moving medicine forward.